And I think what Dawkins wants to do is he wants to say, I like the branches, but I want us to get rid of all the seed. We don't really need that. We can don't bother watering it, don't bother putting fertilizer on it. That's not what matters anyways. Let's focus on the branches. Well, how do you think the branches got there? Well, the branches got there because they grew from the seed.
Love God, love people, love people, love people, love people. It's the AC Podcast. For the love of God, love people.
Andy and Wes here from Apologetics Canada. We're in Egypt working on a new project called Can I Trust the Bible?
Well, you might be asking the question, well, why are Andy and I here in Egypt to talk about the complexities and issues regarding the Bible? Well, the reality of it is the vast majority of those handwritten copies, what we call the manuscripts of the Bible, and particularly the earliest ones, come from Egypt.
And with your doctoral work in the area of theology and manuscripts, what got you interested in the Bible?
I realized that I was engaging with a lot of people, skeptics of all different stripes, and all of them would resort to some sort of, well, that sounds great, Wes, but all you're relying on is the Bible. That's your foundation. And you can't trust that. All you have are translations of translations of translations. All you have are error-ridden copies. You don't even know if you have the right books. You're reading Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, but have you ever heard of the Gospel of Thomas? And so I realized that if that was true, I'm staking my entire life on the person of Jesus. And where do I find the information about Jesus? I find that in the Bible. And if I can't trust the Bible, I really have no reason to put my hope and trust in Jesus.
Hey there, I'm Lysandria, and I'm the intern here at Apologetics Canada. I wanted to let you guys in on a super sweet opportunity coming up just around the corner in May. On May 3rd to 5th, the AC team and a few special guests are hosting another Leadership Summit Ontario. The Leadership Summit is a weekend initiative to bring together young, aspiring thought leaders from all across Canada who are hungry for discipleship, intentional leadership training, and rich networking with other young adults like yourself. The weekend is hosted at the beautiful Camp Madiba just east of Muskoka. So if this is something you're interested in, you should register now because spots are limited. To register and to find out more, you can go on apologeticscanada.com/leadership-summit-on. I hope to see you there.
Hey everyone, welcome to the AC Podcast. This is Steve Kim. I'm your host today, and I'm here with Wesley Huff. How you doing, man?
I'm doing well. It's a good day, a little bit rainy, but April showers, spring May flowers. So it's what's expected, I guess.
Yeah, today we have an interesting topic to talk about. Right now, as we're recording this, we're seeing a lot of people talk about this on the interwebs out there.
Yeah, so there was this interview that was done with the famous new atheist Richard Dawkins, the individual who wrote The God Delusion and was famous for mocking religion. But he did this interview in the UK. And the premise of the interview was actually on the fact that there seemed to be a lot more promotion of Ramadan during the Easter Lent season than there was for Easter in the UK. And so they were going back and forth on this topic. And Dawkins described himself as a cultural Christian, which I think surprised a lot of people. It's why it's gaining a lot of attention is because this person who is so famous for bringing pessimism and even almost like a vitriol towards religion and Christianity in general is now using the moniker of Christian, albeit a cultural Christian.
Yeah, I found that really interesting, even though this wasn't the first time he's called himself that, right? I found articles going back as far as 2007 where he talks about how, I am a cultural Christian. I sing Christmas carols and so on. But for some reason, this time it seems to have really caught everybody's attention. I remember, as vitriolic as he can be about religion in general and Christianity in particular, he also doesn't really like Islam. In fact, he says that he much prefers Christianity over Islam. And it's not even so much that he likes Christianity per se, but he just thinks, out of all the terrible options that we've got going on here, in his opinion, Islam is worse. And so he identifies himself rather as a cultural Christian. Almost, it seems to me almost like he's trying to sort of keep Islam at an arm's length. That's what it seems like to me. But what was your reaction seeing Dawkins call himself a cultural Christian?
Yeah, I think, like you said, it's not necessarily something that's new. You have those instances where he's referred to, Christianity, at least culturally, as a net positive for society. I tracked down some tweets that he made going, back to 2011. He did one recently, recently, in sort of air quotes, in 2018, where he has a picture of himself sitting on a park bench in front of a cathedral. And he says, listening to the lovely bells of Winchester, one of our great medieval cathedrals, so much nicer than the aggressive sounding Allahu Akbar. Or is that just my cultural upbringing? And I think he actually touches on a few things there. I think it is his cultural upbringing. I think the fact that he lives in the West, in the UK, does mean something. I mean, he was always famous for saying if you were born in another country, you'd probably be, if you were born in India, you'd be a Hindu. Yeah. If you were born in, Steve, you were born in Korea. You're not currently a Buddhist. I was born in Pakistan. I'm not currently a Muslim. So yeah, that argument only has so much weight with, people like you and I who are not necessarily the religious worldview of the country of our, if you want to call it, origin in that way. But I think when Dawkins says that he's a cultural Christian, he's probably revealing more than he even realizes, because I think he realizes that there's something just assumed about the ability to say, I hold Christianity in a higher regard than I do Islam, that is an inheritance of the Christian worldview to begin with. This idea of secular being separate from religious, that kind of level of tolerance, that is born out of particularly the Protestant Reformation, but not limited to that, the Christian worldview in general that's affected the West.
Yeah, you could trace it as far back as even Augustine, that he started seeing this kind of separation between the civic powers and the ecclesiastical powers. And I think it was Tom Holland, again, not the Spider-Man, but the agnostic UK historian. He kind of traces that thought, right? And he goes, if I remember correctly, as far back as Augustine. Not that, it's one thing for somebody to have, an inkling of a thought and then for it to be like a really full-blown thing later. But having said that, one of the things that he says is that Christianity spreads in two ways, right? One is through evangelism, another is through secularism, in the sense that this idea of secularism in some ways owes its, I'm not sure I want to say origin, but it has some Christian background to it in terms of how it came about, I think. And so, so it's interesting that even Dawkins calling himself a cultural Christian as opposed to, Islam, it does say something. I don't know if he realizes that even. I doubt that he does.
No, and I think it's interesting that he makes this comment that out of Christianity and Islam, he would choose Christianity 10 times out of 10, because I think that is actually the choice nowadays in sort of the broader religious context. It's not between Christianity and atheism. Atheism is largely a very small, pocketed movement of Western, primarily white males, if we're really being honest about the statistics. But the religious options globally in terms of where things are headed, it really is between Christianity and Islam. And so I think he does put his finger on something interesting there, even though it's not necessarily the focus. He's making a comment on something else. But I think he is actually pointing out a bigger global reality about what's going on. If you go around the world, a lot of countries have either a Christian or a current kind of Muslim heritage about them. Not every country, obviously, but across Africa, Asia, even parts of, going up into Europe, like Spain and Portugal, that kind of share both a Christian and a Muslim heritage. But I think it was an interesting comment.
Having said that, this is a bit of a tangent, but a lot of people will have, those at least Christians who are really into apologetics will have noticed that a lot of Christian apologists spend a lot of time with atheism. And sometimes I wonder, right, is that the right place where we should be focusing our time and energy? Because really, by far, the more common sort of religious belief, if you will, or some kind of a spiritual worldview that you come across is New Age. I find that to be the more common one by far than atheism. Having said that, what I do see is that atheism, and it's often accompanied cousin of a worldview, if you will, naturalism or physicalism, that this physical world is all there is. I do find that it has a great deal of sway in, well, it's sort of embedded in the minds, I think, of a lot of our cultural institutions, really influential ones like the media, the government, the university. There is this kind of assumed naturalism, at least methodologically, right, in terms of how we run society, we should just assume naturalism. But anyway, it does make me wonder, like, as people working in a Christian apologetics ministry, where are we really spending our time, and how should we go about it? But having said that, I do think you are observing correctly that atheism is very much a minority worldview globally. Having said all of that, bringing this back to Richard Dawkins and his sort of identification as a cultural Christian, I think you see a lot of that in, for example, Judaism. Like if you are the kind of a person who watches a lot of conservative political commentators like Ben Shapiro and Dennis Prager, you might think, that's representative of Judaism, right? But they're actually very much in the minority. Most Jewish people that you come across, they'll be culturally Jewish in the same sense that you and I are Canadian. That's what we're, that's how we identify ourselves. But in terms of Jews who actually practice Judaism and follow its teachings, those would be really hard to come by. And really, if you talk to these Jews, these secular Jews, you'll find very quickly that a lot of them are atheists, a lot of them are naturalists. They don't really believe that there is anything supernatural in the world. And so that's the kind of feel that I get when I hear Richard Dawkins calling himself culturally Christian.
Right.
So it doesn't at all mean, of course, that he believes any of this stuff, and he's quite clear about that. But he enjoys the sort of the cultural heritage of it. Its architecture, the arts, the sort of the vestiges that you find in the legal system in the West, so on and so forth.
Yeah, and I was telling you a little bit beforehand, Steve, that one of the things this reminded me of is the parable of the sower in Matthew chapter 13.
Yeah. Tell us about that, because I found that really fascinating, because I'd never really read that parable in that way.
Yeah, I've thought about this a few times, and I'm far from the only person who's ever pointed this out. But I do find it interesting that at the beginning of Matthew chapter 13, in verse 4, it says, "And as he sowed," that's the sower, the farmer, Some seeds fell along the
Parable of the
path.
sower, yeah.
Yeah. And the birds came and devoured them. So you have birds that are devouring the seeds. But if you skip ahead to verse 32 in chapter 13, it says that it is the smallest of the seeds, talking about the mustard seed. But when it is grown, it is larger than all the garden plants. It becomes a tree, so that the birds of the air come and make its nests in its branches. And what Dawkins reminded me of, if we're going to kind of pull two different parables together, the parable of the sower and the parable of the mustard seed, is that Dawkins is interested in the seed that's grown. The seed grows, it's the tree, and Dawkins is as the person who's skeptical of Christianity, who's hostile to Christianity, is the bird that's initially pecking at the seeds, but then once the seed grows into a tree, he's then nesting in the branches. It's a home for him. He finds safety in it. And I think what Dawkins wants to do is he wants to say, I like the branches, but I want us to get rid of all the seed. We don't really need that. We can don't bother watering it. Don't bother putting fertilizer on it. That's not what matters anyways. Let's focus on the branches. Well, how do you think the branches got there? Well, the branches got there because they grew from the seed. And so I think we probably have people who, whether they know it or not, benefit from the fruits and from the growth and from the safety of Christianity in things like like you mentioned, our legal system, even some of the stuff we've been talking about this toleration aspect of society. You don't get that in India. You don't get that in Pakistan. You don't get that in Saudi Arabia. You don't get that in China. You get that in the West. And there's a very specific reason for that. It's because the seeds were planted long ago and they grew, and what eventually became the full-bodied tree is that which allows those things. And so Dawkins wants to do two things simultaneously, like the two parables. He wants to be the bird that pecks at the seeds, but then he also wants to be the bird that nests in its branches.
Yeah. And I think a lot of the times people don't really recognize the branches that they're sitting in comes from those roots. Like I don't think a bird, just, letting my imagination run, right? And admittedly, this is speculative, but imagine those birds that are in the branches. I'm not sure that those birds really care one whit where these branches come from, as long as the protection is there, as long as they can make their nests there.
Right.
In the same way, I find that a lot of people don't really understand how we get a lot of our sort of cultural notions that we actually cherish, where we get them from. We love to root for the underdogs, right? We love to raise up, like we have a real soft spot as a culture for people who have disability or whatever it might be. And those things haven't always been, this is not just some universal value that everyone on the planet just self-evidently holds to. This is a particular value that I think we have that have been inculcated in the crucible of Christianity, I would say. And so you kind of wonder, and sometimes I see people like, for example, that clip that's been going around of Jordan Peterson for a while, where he is being interviewed and about how when God died, science died too. And the interviewer was like, well, how so? Like he doesn't understand just the immense influence that Christianity has had in the development of the modern sciences. I wouldn't say that Christianity was the only source of modern science, but it's certainly not like how new atheists like Richard Dawkins would say, right? This is, science has come about despite Christianity, not because of it, right? He just doesn't see that you actually need a certain kind of a view of the world in order to get something like modern science to take off. So I find that interesting. It's another one of those, you see the branches, but you don't really care about where those branches actually come from.
Yeah, let me give you another one because this is one I did a 2 talks at Laurier University and at Waterloo University. It was the same talk, back-to-back nights, but they asked me to talk on the subject of, is Christianity still relevant? And one of my points I pulled from Glenn Scrivener's The Air We Breathe, which is kind of a synopsis of Tom Holland's book that you were talking about before. He kind of takes a lot of Tom Holland's big brick of a book and he synthesizes it a little bit. But he has one chapter on consent. And I found it very, very interesting. And so I included it in my talk because what he talks about there is that in the ancient world, particularly prior to the rise of Christianity and the Judeo-Christian ethnic branching outside of the geographical and ethnic bounds of Israel, there was no such thing as consent. And that in the ancient world, both in the ancient Near East and in Greco-Roman antiquity, it was expected that female modesty included absolute virginity until marriage and complete chastity within it. But modesty for men was mostly just not going into excess in your like sexual exploits. In classical Latin, there is no actual natural way to refer to a male virgin because it was expected that if you were an adult male, you were not a virgin. So it becomes awkward to even describe the term virgin for a male because the sexual and moral economy of the day relied on free and available sex to anyone, particularly a male, particularly a free Roman male, anytime they wanted it. You know, whether that was with concubines or prostitutes or slaves or whoever. Now, there's 25 different ways to say female prostitute, but there's no natural way to say a virgin male. And
yeah, that's interesting. I do remember, sorry to cut in here, but I do remember that conversation we had a while back about how do archaeologists know that they've uncovered a brothel? And then you talked about, I remember how in Roman society, you had brothels in what would be considered today. I mean, they would be everywhere, but even in places more like what we would consider today sort of the upper middle class neighborhood, and just a brothel just sitting there. And that's where guys would hang out. And you were just expected to participate, in the intercourse of things. And if you didn't, you were kind of considered a prude. What's wrong with you kind of thing? Why aren't you hanging out with us kind of an idea? So that's interesting. That's the kind of the climate in which then somebody like Paul comes in.
Yeah.
And has that ethic of marriage. Now, if I were to try to explain it, I think I would botch it. So let me hand this over to you, Wes. Paul's ethic of marriage and how that actually elevated the status of women.
Yeah, what's interesting about Paul's ethic of marriage is that he says, okay, the standard that women in society are held to, actually, I'm going to hold men to that too. That, this celibacy aspect and this one marriage to one person and one devotion within your sexual commitment to that person, that's limited to your wife, and actually your sexual relationship needs to be predicated on your wife and hers needs to be predicated on you as her husband. That was very countercultural to hold the male to the same sexual ethic as the female. And that's where the cultural norms really would have been broken, because that was not the norm. The norm was, hey, if you're a guy, you can have it whenever you want, wherever you want, and there's going to be an expected free availability to it. Kind of like the internet with pornography, that it's just kind of, it's out there. It's this cat that's been let out of the bag. It's free, it's available, and you can just, get it when you want it.
So that's fascinating. This is, yet another example of the kind of cultural influence that Christianity has had. I mean, I grew up, for example, and this is not just in the West either, right? In fact, the book that Tom Holland wrote, the subtitle, at least in North America, is How the Christian Revolution Remade the World. And he talks about the influence that Christianity has had, not just in the West, but globally. Me coming from the East, growing up, historically, yeah, guys with concubines, multiple wives, though you could see those things. You would not see that today.
Yeah.
Why is that? Well, it's because of the Christian influence that came in from the West. And in fact, this often men in South Korea, they complain that, women actually have a higher status in the eyes of society than men. Of course, it doesn't always turn out that way. Women do face a lot of societal obstacles, especially when it comes to employment and those kinds of things. Taking maternity leave is very difficult. There's often this implicit or explicit pressure to quit, and that sort of thing. They do face those societal obstacles. But having said that, I would argue that women are faring much better today in a lot of ways than 200 years ago, let's say, where women were just expected to basically cook and clean and bear children, and that's all there is to it.
Yeah.
And often you were one out of many.
Yeah. And Rodney Stark, who's a historian and sociologist of religion, in his book, The Rise of Christianity, he has this interesting section where he talks about the fact that he argues that you can track empirically the agency of women across the ancient world into the modern world by the movement of Christianity in particular. That whenever an area became populated by Christians, you see the direct correlation with things like the privileges and treatment of women expanding in a time when, whether we're talking about like the ancient European culture or the Greco-Roman culture or parts of like Asian, North African culture, that women were relegated to a lower status, not all of the time, but the majority of the time. And that when you start to see that change is immediately after the introduction of Christian missionaries within those geographical areas.
Yeah, so these are all great examples of the branches, like we mentioned earlier.
Mm-hmm.
So what do we make of this in the end then, right? With Richard Dawkins identifying as a cultural Christian, but at the same time, he's the same guy, right, who was invited to the so-called Reason Rally years ago, and he was outright calling for it was ironic, right? Because the rally was called the Reason Rally, but what he was calling for was actually don't reason with religious believers, ridicule them, mock them, because they don't deserve a decent conversation because what they believe is so ridiculous. And yet, on the other hand, he has this, I don't know if I want to call it respect, but certainly some kind of an attachment to the Christian heritage and the West. What do we make of this?
I think this provides a unique opportunity for us as Christians to really grab onto that and say, hey, let's explore that. Why is it, Ricky? No, I'm not going to call him Ricky. I feel like that's a little bit disparaging. Richard, why is it that you find the cultural aspect of Christianity so appealing? Let's dig into that, because I want to encourage that in you. I want to encourage that in everyone around you, because I think that there's something that we should continue to encourage people to see that. And we should continue to point out the fact that things like consent, things like universal human rights, things like even, public education, available health care, all these things have roots in a Christian heritage, or at least they're downstream from their Christian inheritance. So why do you think that is? Let's explore the reasons why that is. And I want to make you as comfortable in that tree as possible, but also expose that you pecking at the roots or pecking at the seeds is you planting your feet firmly in midair and then trying to take a leap, and it's not going to work. So I think it's I think we can take this as an encouraging moment where we are seeing the demise of atheism, but we are seeing at the same time people looking for things like meaning and purpose. And there's a perceived attractiveness about cultural Christianity. And I think we should start, asking people those probing questions and exposing why that really does exist.
That reminds me of this study that I wrote a synopsis for years ago. Actually, that was one of the first things that I've ever written for Apologetics Canada years ago when I first started, just volunteering, following Andy around, just shadowing him or whatever. One of the things that he asked me to do was to read the study that had just come out at that time called Hemorrhaging Faith, which was looking into the reasons why young people in Canada were leaving the church. And they identified a number of key things, and I wrote a synopsis for it and put that up. One of the things that I noticed was the mention of individualism, that there's a lot of cultural sort of, you imbibe that sort of individualism growing up in a Western culture. And I just couldn't help but notice that it was that kind of extreme kind of individualism, because individualism isn't all bad, because individualism has some ties to the idea of human rights, because you as an individual get human rights. But that kind of extreme individualism where you kind of have to remake yourself and you got to be on your own, you got to be totally independent, and that sort of thing, really, it was making people miserable. Young people are feeling lonely and whatnot. And I just noticed, isn't that interesting? Because in a sense, individualism is an idea. That kind of extreme individualism is an idea. But our longing for community, that's built into our nature. That's human nature. So if there's an idea that goes against the way humans really are, then that worldview has to either live on borrowed capital, right? Or just it has to artificially sustain itself in some way. That's my sort of working theory. So I think in the same way, I wonder, again, I speaking as a Christian and presupposing the truth of the Christian worldview here, if we are created in such a way to long for communion with God, that right relationship with one another, we have this longing in our hearts for greater things that are not merely physical, like meaning, purpose, value, those kinds of things. And here is a worldview that denies all of that, or at least only pays lip service to it, or radically redefines what those things mean, like value, meaning, and purpose, to the point where you're just not talking about the same things anymore. Then I wonder if atheism is doing that exact same thing, right? Just, okay, it's an idea, but it doesn't match with the reality of human nature. And so it has to be sort of artificially kept alive. I wonder, just thinking out loud.
Richard Dawkins he's a very notable example of this. But a lot of the people around us, especially in the day and age we live in, probably have similar sentiments, although they might not articulate them as well as Dawkins does. They're probably living on that borrowed capital, and they're probably living on assumed presuppositions about what society should look like, how people should act within, civil communities, that sort of thing. And especially when we live in a day and an age where things like justice are seen as these really high ethics, I think we can be both encouraged by that, and we can also take those as opportunities as believers to speak into the lives of people around us who might not know where that comes from. Because ultimately, those good virtues, those are outpourings of God. Those are aspects of his character which we live out because we're created in his image. And we should encourage people when they're really passionate about something like justice, that they should be passionate about justice, but they might not totally understand what that word really means. And they might be operating on presuppositions of how to both define that and ground that kind of topic. And, this is obviously talking about it on a more philosophical level, but in just normal conversations with people who are operating on the assumptions that we should be good, we should be decent to other people, we should fight for the rights of the marginalized, we should root for the underdog, like you said, Steve. Just saying, hi, that's interesting. Where do you think that comes from? How do we get there? Where do you think you find the value in that? Because these are opportunities for gospel and spiritual conversations that can lead us, maybe not at that moment, maybe years from now, maybe, down the road, to plant a seed here and there and to have people start thinking about, oh, okay, yeah, I do think we should stand up for the marginalized and the disenfranchised. Why is that? Because, that's not something that everybody throughout history has assumed. Some people have the ethic of love your neighbor. Some people have the ethic of eat your neighbor. And so why are we assuming one and decrying the other? I think these conversations within our society give us opportunities.
Well, let's leave it there for now. Thank you, listeners, viewers, for joining us on this week's edition of the AC Podcast. The AC Podcast is a ministry of Apologetics Canada. You can smash that like and subscribe button, follow us, and help us get exposure on all of your favorite streaming platforms. Thank you again. We'll come back next week with more stuff to think about. Until then, love God, love people. Bye for now.
It's the AC Podcast. For the love of God, love people.